Hello everyone and welcome to Green Magic, your source for all things green and magic. Welcome to the Deck Tech series. This will cover the builds of my own personal decks. I change my decks fairly often and have all of them listed on deckstats.com, so if you're interested in seeing the most current version or look ahead to other decks, you can find me there under Green Magic, and there's a direct link in the description. Each deck will be featured in two parts. The first video to each deck tech will show all 100 cards contained in the deck, prices for those cards, and some insight for the interactions between cards. It's important when building a deck to have goals, restrictions, and themes, so I'll be sure to cover where the decks are coming from. The second video for each commander will be about changes and alterations you could make to the deck. Personalizing your decks is important to most players, so if you like a commander and want to build it yourself, I'm including several recommendations for you to make the deck your own. Alright, welcome to part 2 of the Marwyn the Nurturer deck tech, which is the first in the deck tech series. This one will be about all the alternative cards that you could put into the deck if you choose. This is just a way for you to maybe take the deck that I've built as a baseline and then make modifications to that so you can personalize it, or depending on card availability, things like that. So real quick, let's just look at some of the stats to the one that I built. It is valued at $418.49. It has the rule of I don't want it to go infinite, and I do want it to have 60 elves in it. Now, obviously, if you were to modify it to your own specs, you would probably reduce the number of elves. That's your business. But the stats of the deck are also that it has 25 lands, 60 creatures, 3 artifacts, 6 enchantments, 2 instants, 4 sorceries, and no planeswalkers. None of the other numbers really matter that much. The only 2 that are really important, or 3 I guess, 25 lands. I keep it to a small number in this deck because there are plenty of mana dorks, including the commander itself, which will produce a lot of mana, so lands are not the primary source of getting mana in this deck. And 60 creatures, again, 60 elves, 60 creatures, all elves. And then the other 15 are just spells of some kind, non-creature spells. I didn't really specify what type or anything. You can see from my deck that I am using, for the 25 lands, a Wirewood Lodge, Nykthos, and Yavimaya Hollow as the only 3 non-basics, and then all the other basics are various unlands, which are more expensive. And obviously, if you're looking to cut down on the cost of the deck, those would be a great place just to replace with basic forest. And then I do want to go over real quick some of the most expensive cards in the deck. Yavimaya Hollow is 38 and change. Allurin is 33 and change. Akroma's Memorial, 24 and change. Finale of Devastation, 21 and change. Nykthos, 21 and change. Eladamri, 15 and change. Nissa is over 12. And Vanquisher's Banner is just shy of 11. Those 8 cards will come out to $178.75. And then there are 5 more cards that are over $5. Kindred Summons, just under $9. Coat of Arms, 7 and change. Guardian Project, 6 and change. Zendikar Resurgence over 6. And Guiltleaf Archdruid is almost 6. Those 5 cards add up to $34.61. The basic lands that are all the special unlands are $134.82. So if you were to try and make the deck more budget, you could easily cut these ones out, or you would have to cut these ones out. And you could save $348.18, bringing down the deck to $70.31, but you would only have 87 out of 100 cards, which isn't a problem. 13 extra cards will still be pretty budget. But the alternatives that this deck will focus on will follow the full spectrum of cost. So while I will definitely point out the ones that are budget and make a point of making it clear what isn't a budget alternative, I'm going to show everything, and you can see good cards that you might want to include in the deck even if you weren't trying to make it cheaper. So starting with the card draw cards, the Great Henge, it's a 9 mana artifact, double green. It says that it costs X less to cast where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Tap it for double green and gain 2 life. And then whenever a non-token creature ETBs, you put a 1/1 counter on it and draw a card. So this one, with Marwyn getting bigger and bigger, this one on turn 4 or 5 could easily just be a few mana, and so it's a very cheap, reasonable price to get it onto the battlefield. And then it also taps for a couple mana. The main reason that you would want it in the deck, obviously, is for the card draw. The reason that I don't include it in mine is because I include Genesis Wave, and this is not a May card draw ability, so if I hit it with Genesis Wave, I could end up decking myself out. Glimpse of Nature is a single green. It's a sorcery. Whenever you cast a creature that's turn, you draw a card. So this is a one-turn massive card draw effect. It's a way to basically storm off on creature spells in one turn. It's a great card. I just didn't include it because I would rather have the option of drawing on more than one turn. Inspiring Call is a 3 mana, including a single green instant. You draw a card for each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it, and then those creatures gain indestructible. So that card is going to be included in most Marwyn decks, more so as a protection, sort of like a heroic intervention, shroud, anti-board wipe type card, just to protect it, more so than it is for the card draw. With Marwyn, you are guaranteed to at least draw the one card, but there are several ways within the deck to add counters to your other creatures. Some of them add counters to themselves, some spread it around. So you could easily draw many more cards with it. So it is a good inclusion. I just choose not to. That's up to you. And it, obviously, for the protection aspect of it, that would make it a good inclusion if you are looking to build your own Marwyn deck. Next, Garruk's Uprising, a 3 mana, including a single green enchantment. When it ETBs, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. Creatures you control have trample. Whenever a creature with power 4 or greater ETBs, draw a card. So this one is brand new, and I just haven't had a chance to put in the deck, but I'm sure I will. So when this comes into play, Marwyn's probably going to be power 4 or greater, so you will draw a card off of it. Then your creatures have trample, which is great. You want that. And then if you have enough Lords out, or a Coat of Arms, or Vanquisher's Banner, stuff like that, then your creatures, your small creatures, might actually have power 4 or greater when ETBing, so you'll draw a card off of each of those. But again, if you hit this with Genesis Wave, it's not a May, so that is risky. Elemental Bond, same thing, 3 mana, including a single green enchantment, but it's power 3 or greater. Draw a card. Cavulator is 3 mana, including a single green enchantment. Whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters, its controller draws a card. So that one is universal. It applies to all of your opponents as well. All of these make a lot of sense with the deck, with Marwyn, not Marwyn, but with all of the Lords buffing up the other creatures. You play a 1/1, but it enters as a 3/3 or 4/4 or 5/5 or 10/10, depending on what you have out. You can draw a card basically off every creature after a certain point. Again, I don't run these partially because, or in large part because of Genesis Wave. That really hinders what some of these cards are capable of, or it makes them backfire in ways that I don't want to do. Soul's Majesty is a 5 mana, including single green. Draw a card equal to the power of target creature you control. So this one goes poorly with Eladamri, because Eladamri gives your stuff Shroud, and you do have to target a creature with this. So there's a little bit of a nombo there. Otherwise, you just choose Marwyn basically every time and draw between 5 and 20 cards, depending on how big she's gotten. Garruk is a 5 mana, including triple green planeswalker, and the only ability you care about is the -3. He comes in with 3 loyalty. He has a -3. I always think of it as an ult, because that's basically what it does, is enter, ult, go away. Draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. That one doesn't target, so even if you do have Shroud, you would still get that many cards. Rishkar's Expertise is a 6 mana version of this, where you draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control, but after you draw the cards, you then get to cast a spell that's CMC 5 or less without paying its mana cost. All 3 of these would be really great in the deck, and there are definitely things that you should include if you want to build this deck for yourself. Next are a few creatures that will draw you cards as they ETB. Multani's Acolyte, which is double green. It's an elf. It has Echo, meaning the turn after it ETBs, you have to pay its mana cost or sacrifice it. When it ETBs, draw a card. Master Myers and Shaman of Spring are both 4 mana each. Master Myers is double green. Shaman of Spring is a single green. Master Myers is a 3/2 Elf Shaman. When it ETBs, draw a card, but it also has this extra ability. If it's in the graveyard and you cast a creature spell, you may pay double green to return it to your hand. Shaman of Spring doesn't have that, and it's a 2/2. These are all just little easy and good ways that you could put those into the elf creature slot and also draw cards off of them. Just cantrip, which is helping to grow Marwyn. It's helping to draw you cards. It's helping you to swarm the board. They're definitely good things that should usually be included in this deck. Next are a couple of cards that will draw you cards based on how many you have, how many creatures. Collective Unconscious, 6 mana including double green, draw a card for each creature you control. And then Freyalise Llanowar's Fury is a 5 mana including double green planeswalker, has 3 loyalty. Her +2 is to make an elf druid, which is great for both the ramp and getting Marwyn bigger because it's an elf. And then her -6 is to draw a card for each green creature you control, which is usually going to be a lot. The reason I don't include this one though is because the card draw is not immediate. You would have to wait 2 turns to draw any cards, and that's kind of risky, so I don't like that. The Collective Unconscious is really good. It's basically just another Shamanic Revelation, but for 1 extra mana and without the life gain. But it would be a good redundancy in a Marwyn deck, and I would recommend it. Next are a couple cards that just draw you 1 card per turn, assuming you have a big creature. Colossal Majesty, 3 mana enchantment, including a single green. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. That should usually be no problem if Marwyn's out. And then Triumph of Ferocity, 3 mana, including a single green enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, draw a card if you control the creature with the greatest power or tied for the greatest power. Usually not a problem if Marwyn's out. So these ones I don't necessarily like because it's 1 card per turn and it's kind of slow because they don't even draw you on the turn that they come out. So it'd be you play this and then you still have to wait a turn to draw any cards. And that's assuming that there's no board wipe or that these aren't destroyed. That's too slow to me because the way that I built the Marwyn deck is to try and speed out as fast as possible. And these are very, very slow for card draw relative to what this deck is trying to do. So now let's look at all of those card draw cards on a budget scale. You can see here that 4 of them are $4 or more. That would be Great Henge, Glimpse of Nature, Freyalise, and Rishkar's Expertise. There are 4 that are between $1 and $5, Soul's Majesty, Garruk, Collective Unconscious, and Elemental Bond. And then the rest are under $1. You got the very cheap ones are the creatures, which are great because this is a creature-heavy deck, and those fit in the creature slots very easily. So they're super budget, and they're extremely on theme for the deck. Some of the other ones in the super budget realm, the Triumph and the Colossal, like I said, I'm not huge on those, but a lot of the other ones, Garruk's Uprising, and the yellow ones, the Collective Unconscious, Garruk, Primal Hunter, and Soul's Majesty, there are a lot of great card draw options that are still relatively cheap. Next, let's talk about some of the mana dorks. You've got a couple of elves that will allow you to tap elves to generate mana. Heritage Druid, single green, 1/1 elf druid. Tap 3 untapped elves to add triple green. Birch Lore Rangers is a single green, 1/1 elf. I believe it's a druid. Tap 2 untapped elves you control, add 1 mana to your mana pool. And he also has Morph if you care. The Birch Lore Rangers is significantly less affected because you need 2 creatures to create 1 mana. Heritage is 3 for 3. But these are both great for all of the elves that come into play that have summoning sickness. You can tap them to generate mana to keep your turn going and keep progressing further. And these, if I had them in my deck, have certainly been games where if I hit one of these, then it could save me because I could tap the elves. Because I don't have haste and I need more mana, I could tap the elves that are, the 50 elves I have in play for mana to keep going until I get that haste and I'm able to do stuff. I just didn't include him because I don't necessarily like the effect. I mean, it's a strong effect, it's a good effect, it's just not one that I'm jumping out of my way to throw in every deck. I do have these in at least one other deck, maybe two, but they are definitely something that I held back on that you should consider not holding back on. Next are Devoted Druid. It's a 2 mana, including a single green, 0/2 Elf Druid, tap to add a green, and then you can put a -1/-1 counter on it to untap it. So it'll always tap for 1 mana, and then on a single turn, you could tap it for 2 mana, basically. Unless you have a way to put a bunch of 1/1 counters on it and then proliferate or something like that. There is that elf from the other video that you saw where you tap it and you put a number of 1/1 counters on a creature equal to the number of elves in play. So if your major mana dorks are already tapped and then you had him who wasn't summoning sick and wasn't untapped, you could tap the other thing to put a bunch of counters on it and then start removing them and generating a ton of mana. But pretty narrow, trick there. Beastcaller Savant. This one has haste. You can add a mana of any color. It's good, but you can only use the mana to cast a creature spell, which isn't too much of a problem in this deck because it's mostly creatures. But oftentimes you're going to want to cast a non-creature, and I don't like that limitation. Bloom Tender, this one is good in multicolored decks, but here as a 2 mana that taps for 1 mana of any color, well, it'll tap for 1 green mana. It's not a great option relative to price. Next, Incubation Druid. This one is 2 mana. It's a 0/2. It'll tap for 1, or if it's got some 1/1 counters on it, then it will tap for 3. Druid of the Cowl is a 2 mana, tap for 1. Elfheim Druid, 2 mana, tap for 1, or it could tap for 2 to cast a kicked spell. There is that one kicked spell, the Draga Warcaller, in the deck. So on extremely rare occasion, you could add an extra mana to kick it here. Not a huge deal. Next, you've got Leaf Gilder, Paradise Druid, Quirion Explorer. These are all 2 mana, tap for 1. The Paradise will tap for 1 of any color, and it has hexproof if it's untapped. Quirion Explorer will tap for 1 mana of a color that an opponent's land could produce. Worst case scenario, you produce like a blue or black or something, and it just pays the generic mana cost of a creature spell. Next, you got Woodland Mystic, Wirewood Elf, and Servant of the Conduit. These are all 2 mana, tap for 1 mana. Servant of the Conduit is the worst because it requires energy counters to do it, so it gives you 2, meaning you can only tap it twice to add mana, so it's on a shorter clock. Then again, with the deck trying to play really fast, maybe that's not such a big deal. Next, you've got Rosethorn Acolyte, Sohana, Starfletcher, and Lifespring Druid. These are all 3 mana. Tap to add a single mana. They'll give you mana of any color, but it doesn't really matter in a monocolor deck. The Sohana Starfletcher also has reach, so that's kind of cool, and it'll help you if you need more flyer hate. Next would be Rishkar Pima Renegade. It's a 3 mana, 2/2 legendary elf druid. When it ETBs, you put a 1/1 counter on up to 2 target creatures, and each creature with a 1/1 counter on it can tap to add a green. So you could either spread these out over your creatures to give you more mana dorks, or you could put at least one of them on Marwyn to make her even bigger so she just taps for more. Either way is fine. Savala, Heart of the Wilds, 3 mana, including double green, 2/3 legendary creature Elf Scout. Whenever any creature besides her ETBs, its controller may draw a card if its power is the greatest on the battlefield. And then you can pay a green and tap her to add X mana and any combination of colors where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. So the card draw ability here, if you get her out super early, an opponent might benefit off of that real quick before you get Marwyn up big enough to where she's the biggest creature out there. But the ability to add mana, basically Selvala is like a Marwyn minus 1 mana. Because however big Marwyn is, which will probably be the biggest creature, that's the biggest creature that Selvala is going to add mana for, but Selvala costs 1 to activate. So you basically get to double up that ability, which is very powerful, and I should probably include in the deck. I just don't. I just have chosen not to. Next would be Sky Shroud Troopers. That is a 4 mana dork that only taps for 1 green. Not a great elf. But it is a 3/3 body, so, he's not as terribly weak as some of the others. Looking at that on the budget scale, you see 2 of them are pretty pricey. Bloom Tender, which gives you no added benefit in this deck, and then Selvala, which is actually really good. And then you've got a few of them that are in the $1 to $5 range. Woodland Mystic, I believe that card was only printed in the welcome packs and not in the actual M20 like standard boosters, because it is a common that's over $3. So I'm pretty sure that's why, but I don't entirely remember. Heritage Druid would be a good addition if you're willing to spend a few bucks, and Incubation Druid and Devoted Druid are okay as well. But on the budget end, you do have a ton of elves that are, less than $1 that cost 2 mana, tap for 1, and are good inclusions, and definitely something worth considering adding to a Marwyn deck. Next are a few things that will give you some land ramp. The Quirion Trailblazer, Yavimaya Granger, and Wild Wanderer, all when the ETB get you a basic into play tapped. The Quirion Trailblazer and Wild Wanderer are both 4 mana. The Yavimaya Granger is 3, but it does have Echo, so the turn after it comes into play, you'll have to sack it unless you want to pay another 3 mana for it. Next, you got the Llanowar Scout. This one will tap to allow you to put a land from your hand into play. It goes into play untapped, and it's any land. So it's basically like you get to play 2 lands per turn. Elvish Pioneer, this one when it ETBs, you get to take a basic from your hand and put into play tapped, which makes it a pretty good turn 1 play, or even later after you've maybe drawn a ton of cards. You get one of these to ETB, and then you just get to kind of drain your hand a little bit so that you're not having to move to discard later or whatever issue you might have. Sky Shroud Ranger, this one is just like Llanowar Scout. You just get to put a land from your hand into play. But that one can only be done at sorcery speed. The Sky Shroud Ranger, again, a 1 mana elf, which it makes it a pretty good turn 1 play. And then the non-elf of this group is Traverse the Outlands. It's a 5 mana sorcery, including single green. Search your library for up to X basic lands where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Put them on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. So with Marwyn being 6, 7, 8, 10 power, this can get you that many basic lands, which is not only good ramp for later turns, but right in the moment, it's basically like drawing that many cards, except that they're all lands and that they go into play. But it thins your deck out significantly when you only have 25 lands to begin with, and you've obviously had a few of them out already in your opening hand and that you've played. So you're thinning out your deck somewhat significantly as far as lands, so that whenever you draw cards from other reasons, whether it's just your draw for turn, like if you're not in a good position, or if you've got the card draw like online, every time you play one of your elves, you're going to draw more non-lands, probably elves. So thinning your deck in a very significant, powerful way. Looking at the budget scale, Traverse the Outlands is the only one that's expensive. So if you're trying to go super budget, you can't really hit that card. But if you're willing to spend almost $13, it would be a very, very powerful card in this deck. All the other ones are very budget and would be great inclusions in the deck. One reason that I didn't is just because I have several, one, I probably didn't realize how good some of these cards were at the time, like Llanowar Scout, Sky Shroud Ranger, and Elvish Pioneer. I've since come to realize that these are actually really good cards, and I have them in a few other decks. I haven't touched my Marwyn deck in quite some time, and I might be inclined to include them, but the main reason that I wouldn't is because I have them in other decks, and my Marwyn deck includes a lot of elves that really don't go in other decks and non-elf decks. So it's just me trying to keep my decks a little bit different and unique. But these would be great cards to choose from if you are looking to build Marwyn. Next, there's just some other ways to get you some more mana. Tangleroot. This one says whenever a player casts a spell, this is a global effect. It affects your opponents as well. You get to add green to your mana pool. This one is really great when you're playing, a 1 mana elf and then it pays for itself. Or maybe you play a 2 mana elf and then you refund one of it. It's a great way to keep your turn going. Earthcraft, you just tap an untapped creature to untap a basic land. So if your land just taps for 1, it's a basic forest. Great. If it happens to be equipped or enchanted with that Elvish, Elvish guidance, the aura that says this forest will tap for mana equal to the number of elves you control, or elves in play. If that's equipped to a basic forest, you could tap an elf to untap that land and then add just tons of mana, insane amounts. Not infinite, but insane amounts. And this does not care about summoning sickness. It's like the Birchlore Rangers or the Heritage Druid. You just tap a summoning sick elf, and then you can do that. But it is very expensive. It is reserve list. Doubling Cube, this will just double the amount of mana in your mana pool. It's great, but it just I don't know, it just doesn't feel right to me in this deck. But I'm sure it would perform very well. Growing Rites of Ilmok, I did not realize, did this card double in price in the last couple months? Like, it was not this expensive just a couple months ago. But this is in the deck for kind of 2 reasons. I mean, both parts of it are relevant. When it ETBs, you get to look at the top 4 for an elf or a creature, and then when at the end of your turn, if you have 4 more creatures, then it flips over into Gaia's Cradle or a basic land. So Gaia's Cradle, it'll only tap for green equal to the number of creatures. So if you have 0 creatures, it doesn't add any mana. Ilmok Cradle of the Sun will at least give you the 1 mana if you have no creatures. So obviously, if you get this one out early, but you're not ready to, you're not fully ready to win yet, flip it over. Your next turn, you'll have a ton of mana. That's great. Or if you are in your turn where you're trying to storm off and you're not gonna, your opponents aren't gonna survive another turn, hopefully, so you don't care about the land part of it. The enchantment part of it, when it ETBs, can be super relevant to get you an extra elf. You look at you dig 4 deep to find a creature, and if you've got your card draw on board, you need that creature so that you can cast it, draw 1 or 2 or 3 more cards, and keep digging. It's actually super relevant in that way. I would not recommend underestimating how valuable it can be to dig a little bit to find that 1 extra creature that when you cast it, you draw those extra cards. Then Llanowar Druid, this is a 2 mana elf that you can tap it, sack it, untap all forest. So it won't work on the Ilmok Cradle of the Sun, Nykthos, anything like that. It will only affect your forest. And it does affect your opponent's forest too. Probably don't care. The reason why I did not include this in the deck, and I'm not a fan of it, at least in this deck, is that 1, you have to sacrifice it, and I've traditionally not been huge on sacrificing my own creatures, especially in something that's trying to go wide like this. And 2, because this isn't a land-focused deck. That's not where the ramp is. I don't have 20 lands in play that each tap for 3 or 4 mana. This is a deck that can easily have 3 lands in play on turn 6 or 7, and so yeah, she'll get you 3 mana that way, but not a high performer in this deck. Still, it would be a good inclusion because the ceiling's good, the basement or the floor to it isn't really problematic. Worst case scenario, you sack it for 1 mana, like if you only have 1 forest in play, but this is a card that I am very big on in a lot of other decks, in a lot of circumstances. If you are doing land-based ramp, and especially if you got land mana doublers, but here it's not super great, definitely something that you should at least strongly consider including, though. Next is Mana Reflection. This is just a great card in any deck. With your lands, they'll tap for an extra mana. With things like Marwyn, Priest of Titania, things like that, If they were tapping for 8 or 10, now they'll tap for 16 or 20. Great card. I don't remember why I didn't include it. Probably just because I didn't think that I needed that much more mana, but it probably is a right call. Oh, also, because it costs 6 to get it out, it means that probably turn 4 or 5, you would have to cast it using most of the mana you have, and then you're kind of hampered on that turn. You'd have to still wait a full turn after that to get anywhere. So in a lot of circumstances, yeah, it actually costs you a turn in order to ramp you insanely. Keeper of Progenitus, this is a 4-mana elf that will allow any mountain, forest, or plain to add an extra mana. So I don't like this one in a lot of cases because it affects your opponents. It's not usually too big of a deal, and it is definitely worth including. But in this deck in particular, it's not super great because if you're playing a deck with, like, again, a lot of land-based ramps, so you're cultivating, Kadama's reaching, explosive vegetation, you're just pouring lands onto the battlefield, and you got the mana doublers. Your lands are, you've got a significant number of basic lands that will tap for 2, whereas your opponents, they might be using non-basics and duels and gates and stuff that don't have the basic land type on them. So if you're going into heavy land ramp, then this can benefit you more than your opponents, even though it does benefit your opponents. In a deck like this, where there's so few lands, you might have 3 forests in play. Your opponents might have 5, 6 of whatever basic land that they have. They might benefit more off of it than you. And considering that this is an elf deck with a bunch of mana dorks, you have plenty of ways to generate mana through those elves that doing something that would only get you a little, but potentially your opponents a lot, is not a good trade. So looking at these cards on the budget scale, you see most of them are pretty pricey. The only ones that are cheap are Tangleroot and Llanowar Druid, which are both good choices to include. I do include Tangleroot in a similar deck, Seaton, which is more combo based, and that one does go infinite and is looking to get tricky in other ways. But keeping this a fair non-infinite deck, it would still be pretty good choice, just not... if you're going to maintain 60 elves and only 15 non-elves, that's why it wouldn't make the cut for me. But if you were going to decrease the number of creatures, maybe to 50 or 40, then this would be definitely a good spell to throw in. Next, let's look at some of the removal. Now, this is something that I didn't really talk about in my deck because I don't have any removal in it. But now would be a great time to bring up that point. At one point early on, I did include, I believe, these 3: Reclamation Sage, Viridian Shaman, and Viridian Corruptor. Then, because of Genesis Wave, I took out the Viridian Shaman and the Viridian Corruptor, because when they enter the battlefield, you have to destroy an artifact. And if your opponents don't have one, you're going to lose your own coat of arms or a Chroma's Memorial or something. And hitting these guys and having to blow up your own thing is really bad, especially if the only artifact that you have is a Chroma's Memorial, which is exactly what you're relying on to actually attack that turn and to have haste and everything. The Reclamation Sage has the May ability, so you could choose not to blow anything up. The reason why I didn't still at least include that one source of removal is because I don't want to be in a position in a game where an opponent has like an artifact or enchantment out, and I have one source of removal in my deck that could hit it, and I need to hit that one thing in order to get rid of it to stop them, because then I am frantically digging and searching and trying to get that one thing that'll save me. And especially if you don't have the engine going and you're literally just top decking, I don't want to sit there sit through one person's turn, then another person's turn, then another person's turn. My turn. Great. Do I get it? Flip the card over. It's not it. All right. I do effectively nothing important. Pass turn. Wait for this guy. Wait for that guy. Wait for the next guy. My turn. Do I get it? I don't want to be in that position. I'd rather have 0 so that it's clear. I just don't have the way out. It's better to have redundancies in a deck for all things, and having no redundancy for an important answer if you need it. I'd rather just go down to 0. But these are 3 things that you could and should include in the deck most of the time. I just don't like the possibility of having to hit my own thing. Next, you have Elvish Lyrist, Glissa Sunseeker, and Elvish Scrapper. The Lyrist and Scrapper are only 1 mana, but you have to pay a green and tap them to destroy, in the Lyrist case, an enchantment, in the Scrapper's case, an artifact. So these ones are good in that they're 1 mana elves, so they're great, and they can destroy whatever problem is out there. And because it's an activated ability, you can't stumble on it on accident and have to blow up your own thing. But because, 1, you have to sacrifice them, I don't necessarily like that because it weakens your Priest of Titania, your Coat of Arms, all those things going forward. And also because, also the fact that they're activated abilities means that you can't do it right away. So if it's like on your big storm turn and you don't have haste yet, you stop right there. But they are a good answer that should be included. Glissa is a little bit different because she doesn't sacrifice herself, which is really good, and she'll destroy any artifact with CMC equal to the amount of mana in your mana pool. So as long as you just add enough mana to your mana pool to equal whatever artifact you want to get rid of, you can destroy an artifact every turn with her. But the deck isn't super control-y, so that's not really a huge perk for this deck. Viridian Zealot and Elf Replica, these ones both cost 2, and you have to sacrifice them to destroy, in Viridian Zealot's case, artifact or enchantment. For Elf Replica, it's just an enchantment. So these ones have twice the cost to activate, because it's 2 mana instead of 1 like the Lyricist and the Scrapper. But these ones don't have to tap, so you can do it when they enter. So they are pretty good in that regard. And then when you look at it on a budget scale, the only one that's even over $1 is Glissa. All the other ones are super cheap. So for most of you, there's no reason not to include all of these elves, or at least several of them, as a good source of removal. Next, looking at some things that give you some more creatures. Dwynen's Elite is going to show up in a lot of decks that are Marwyn or even Azuri. She doesn't give you much extra. It's just 1 extra elf warrior token when she ETBs. But 2 bodies for 2 mana is really good, especially with Marwyn, because if you tap your lands or another mana dork to cast her, then you get 2 ETBs, which buffs Marwyn up by 2, so it ends up being almost like free. Sylvan Offering, this one will allow you, so it's green and X. Choose an opponent. You and that player each put an XX green treefolk creature token onto the battlefield. Choose an opponent. You and that player each put X 1/1 green elf warrior creature tokens onto the battlefield. So generally speaking, you choose one opponent to give them a big treefolk and another opponent to get a bunch of little elves. I'm not huge on this card just because it does give your opponents benefit, but you're obviously going to get the best benefit. 1, because you get both halves of it, but you don't care about the treefolk. But you've got the lords for your elves. You got things like Priest of Titania and Marwyn that'll be able to tap for more mana. As you get these extra elves out, Marwyn will get bigger in power and toughness. There is a lot of benefit to this card. It's definitely a good card that should be highly considered in the deck. But again, it takes up a non-creature slot, which I don't really have a lot of room in my deck for a card like this in the non-creature slots. Hunting Triad, this one is just 4 mana, put 3 Elf Warrior tokens into the battlefield. So, good card. Again, non-creature, so it kind of stifled by my deck restriction. Ren's Run Packmaster. This one, you have to champion an elf when you when at ETB. So that means that you have to exile another elf, and then when this leaves, that other elf will return into play. So this one, you can pay 3 mana to create a 2/2 green wolf token, and then your wolves have Death Touch. At one point, I did have this card in my deck. I took it out because I didn't want to get rid of my own elf, the champion and elf part of it. And also, I didn't really care that much about the wolf added option, that tactic. It does give you a way out if you don't really have a lot of card draw, if you just haven't drawn your card draw, but you do have a ton of mana. You know, you cast this, you champion something you don't care about, you pump all that mana into this and create a ton of 2/2 wolves. And then as soon as they're able to attack, you swing out with them. They have Death Touch, so either your opponents take, 20, 30, 40 damage, or they start losing their creatures. Minion Reflector. This is a great card in a lot of decks. It's hard to include in this one just because I have so few non-creature slots. Basically, whenever a non-token creature ETBs, you may pay 2 to create a token copy of it. The token has haste and goes away at end of turn. So, this would be fantastic with cards like Priest of Titania, the Wirewood Channelers, the Elvish Archdruid, those elves that tap for a lot of mana, because you pay the mana to cast them, then you pay 2 to make a token copy of it, which then has haste, so you can add all that extra mana. So this is actually a great card for keeping that big turn going. But it does cost 5 mana to get it out, and then you still have to pay 2 per creature that you do that with. And with a lot of the elves, if it's just kind of a generic elf that doesn't, really any elf that doesn't tap for mana, that ability to get out an extra one with haste isn't super helpful or relevant. But it is actually a great card, and it would do really well for a deck like this. Looking at the budget scale, none of these are terribly expensive. Only the Minion Reflector and Sylvan Offering are over $1. Yeah, they're all okay, just not something that I would go far out of my way to include. Next, let's look at some extra win conditions, because this deck basically only wins through combat, and you do have the ability with the Guildleaf Archer to still have your opponent's land, so even if they have a fog, you could, survive for another turn by stealing all their lands and giving them no way to win. But if your opponents have anything that say like their life total can't change, or you can only attack with 1 creature per turn, or something like that, combat fogs, anything that will hurt you in that regard, you might want some extra win conditions. Aetherflux Reservoir. This is a very well-known commander card. Sees a lot of play in a lot of decks. And in a deck like this, where you're going to be casting a bunch of stuff, it really makes a lot of sense. I have it in 2 decks, and I'm just not looking to include it in too many more. I don't want to be too cliche. Altar of Dementia. This one would also be pretty good in this deck. You just sacrifice a creature, and then a player puts a number of cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power. Mill them. Mill cards equal to the power of that creature. So you could, with Coat of Arms out, you could have, 30 elves, and, just sacrifice 3, mill out a guy for 90, sacrifice 3, mill out a guy for 90, sacrifice 3, mill out the other guy for 90. Assuming that they have no shuffle effects, it's an easy mill. Easy mill. Epic Struggle. This one says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 20 or more creatures, you win the game. So getting a ton of creatures is pretty easy. The only thing that would threaten your win this way is a board wipe, or if someone else combos off on their turn. Stealing all their lands with Guildleaf Archdruid will help protect you from that for the most part. But but it should be pretty easy to pull off. And there is a little bit of opportunity for trickery, because if you have this out and you have like 10 or 12 creatures, your opponents might think that they're safe and be like, okay, I don't have to worry about that this turn. And then you play Kindred Summons, and suddenly that pops out 12 more creatures. So you do have a little bit of room for trickery there too with that small combo. Throne of the God Pharaoh, this one says at the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses life equal to the number of tapped creatures you control. So if your opponents have anything that not only prevent combat damage, but prevent damage, this is loss of life, so it can get around that and help you in that regard. And obviously, a lot of these creatures are mana dorks, even if you don't attack with them. If you tap them for mana, there were some cards that I had previously talked about, like the Heritage Druid, the Birchlore Rangers, the Earthcraft, those other ways of tapping your creatures. You can use that to just have a bunch of creatures that, during your end step, kill your opponents. Looking at them on the budget scale, none of them are too expensive. Aetherflux is over $5. The others are, between $2.80 and almost $4. Not terribly expensive. Pretty reasonable things that you could include in this deck. Next are just some good elves. Taunting Elf, Elvish Bard, Golgari Decoy. These are all just elves that have the, what's that called? The, when you basically taunt something, I think is that what it's called? Provoke. Sort of extreme provoke. All creatures that are able to block these guys have to do so. So these are good if you don't have trample. If you just haven't drawn it, you attack with this and your army of other creatures. The other guys get through. He might be killed, but your other guys will get through. And that's especially great if your opponent has Death Touch. So these are definitely things that would be good to include. Taunting Elf is the best because it only costs 1. The Elvish Bard and the Golgari Decoy at 4 and 5 mana, that's a little harder to justify, but Elvish Bard has just cool art. I really like the look of that, so that might be reason enough to include it in a deck. And then there's a few other good elves. Wildborn Preserver. This one has flash. Don't really care about that. It has the ability, whenever a non-human creature ETBs, you can pay X and put that many counters on it. I guess that's great if you have no card draw left and he's out. You cast one other elf, and then you have 50 mana available to you. So you just pump all that into this ability and put 50 counters on him. You could. But the main reason that I would include this in a deck is for the reach. That's not a great reason to include it in a deck, and I don't go out of my way to make this deck super defensive, but there are a few in my version of the deck. There are a couple others that I think are good potential inclusions, and that's why I'd consider him. Norwood Archers on the other side is the same thing. 4 mana, has reach, it's a 4/4, and it has the Rebecca Guay art, so that's actually a pretty attractive reason to want to include it. Then Allosaurus Shepherd in the middle there, that's a brand new card from Jumpstart, which super expensive. It's pretty good. Basically, it just says all your stuff can't be countered. I don't really play a lot of protection spells. Certainly if you're trying to play this in a CEDH atmosphere, then this card would be important. It would be very important. It would be necessary. But if you're playing this at a casual pod, making your stuff uncounterable is not usually super important. The other ability to pay 6 and make all your elves base power 5/5. Yeah, it's sort of like scale up ability. I think that makes all your creatures 6/4. If you scale up, if you do the overload, it makes all your creatures 6/4 worms in addition to their other stuff. This makes all your stuff 5/5 dinosaurs. So it's almost like that kind of effect. Good, not exciting, not super important for the deck. Looking at it on a budget scale, the Allosaurus Shepherd is crazy expensive. It's a good card, but I don't think I could justify that price for any deck. CDH, sure, but none of my decks. Nothing that I would look at and say the inability to be countered is so important that I'd want to pay that much money for it. So if you're looking to build a budget deck, that's a no-brainer. Like don't even think about that card as being good. The other ones are all under a quarter, so they're actually pretty good price to throw in the deck, especially if you are trying to play super budget and you're looking to cut out some of the $2 elves that have decent abilities. Here are some good choices to just throw in and keep the price line low. Next, let's look at some things that kind of buff either one or more things on the team. Doubling season. There's not a whole lot of token generators, but there's few, and I've mentioned a few in this video that you could add to the deck. So you could double your tokens. All right, that's sure, but the main reason that you would have this is so that every time you put a 1/1 counter on Marwyn, you get 2 instead. So every time you play an elf, you double the counters on Marwyn, which makes her bigger if you wanted to do attack with her, but it also means that you're generating your ability to escalate in the mana she produces doubles. And Primal Vigor will have the same basic effect. The reason that I wouldn't be too eager to put these in the deck is because somewhere, turn 4 or 5 or somewhere in there, you would have to cast one of these and probably nothing else, in which case you've just set yourself back a whole turn, and it might pay off, but it can end up being enough to where it tempos you really bad, because now you have to spend that whole extra turn, at least, kind of get one extra turn of winding up before you swing out. Hardened Scales, this is a 1 mana, same basic reason as the other two that you would include in the deck. If one or more 1/1 counters would be placed on something, it gets one more than that. Because you don't necessarily care about the token part of Doubling Season and Primal Vigor, this one actually would make a lot more sense to include. And because it's only 1 mana, you can get it out pretty early and play it to great effect. Branching Evolution, this one is another 1/1 counter doubler. It's 3 mana, so it's a little bit easier to get out. This one is also a little bit easier to justify putting in the deck than Doubling Season and Primal Vigor. It's up to you. One reason that I also don't like these cards in this deck is because they put all the focus, all the emphasis on Marwyn by herself, and I want this to be an elf deck. I want to cast elves, to play elves. I want to swing with elves. I want elves to do elf things. I don't want it to just be Marwyn center stage. Next are Overwhelming Stampede, which will give all your stuff +X/+X and trample till end of turn, where X is your biggest creature. With Marwyn being 10-12 power, that can really buff your guys up a lot. And if you happen to tap your lands to pay this, now Marwyn's also got +12/+12, so she could tap for 24 mana or attack for 24 damage. So that's really powerful. Definitely something worth including or considering to include. Beastmaster Ascension, 3 mana. Once you've attacked with 7 or more creatures, all your stuff gets +5/+5. Another great buff. Concordant Crossroads, another haste enabler. Definitely something that I have considered and want to include and think I should include. The problem with all 3 of these is that they are non-creature spells, and I'm limited to 15 non-creature spells, and primarily what I need in those slots are card draw. So these ones unfortunately don't make the cut for me, but they are great inclusions. Next, Dragon Throne of Tarkir. This is an equipment that basically the equipped creature has Defender and 2 mana, tap. Other creatures you control gain trample and +X/+X until end of turn, where X is this creature's power. So if you were to put this on Marwyn, now you can make all your other creatures get +10/+10. So it's kind of like an Overwhelming Stampede for all of your other creatures. But because it's an equipment, what you could do is equip this to one of your elves. Let's say you somehow have an elf that's like 5 or 6 power. Equip this to it, tap it, give all your other stuff +5/+5. Now you equip it to another creature. That creature was a 4/4, but it's got +5/+5 from the first elf. Tap it, give all your stuff +9/+9. So now all your stuff has +5/+5 and +9/+9. They're +14/+14s with trample. So it's a great way to keep the line going. So you just escalate your damage on all of the remaining creatures that are able to attack. Door of Destinies. This is a very popular tribal card. Goes in tribal decks of every color. When it ETBs, you choose a creature type. Whenever you cast that creature type, then you put a counter on Door of Destinies, and then your creatures get +1/+1 for each counter on it. Great artifact. Great. This was in an earlier version of my deck, but I took it out because for the same reason that, like I've said with Mana Reflection and Doubling Season and Primal Vigor, you basically have to take a turn off to cast this. If you get this out at a good time. So like turn 2 you get Marwyn out, turn 3 hopefully you cast this and like nothing else. Then on turn 4 you can gradually start building stuff up, but probably the first thing you need to cast is something that'll draw you cards like a Guardian Project or something else, which means that doesn't even bump up your creatures, including Marwyn, right then. So now you gotta wait another turn to get some, to start casting creatures to actually draw and build up. So it really tempos you in a way that slows you down. And if you happen to get this kind of later in the game, turn 7, turn 8, it doesn't do anything. At that point, you're either ready to win or like in the process of trying to get ready to win, or not, or you're just not there at all. Treble Unity, this one is great if you've got a ton of mana and not a whole lot else to do. Also, it's instant speed, so you can do it as a combat trick. Creatures of the creature type of your choice get +X/+X until end of turn. It costs X, 2, and a green. So a great tribal card in green, and a combat trick, and yeah. Next are a couple of things that are, one's a Lord, one's like a half, almost Anthem. Kaisa is a 2/3. This one's an Elf Druid for 5 mana. All green creatures you control get +1/+1. So she does buff herself, so she is a 3/4 effectively. It will affect all those, if you happen to put that wolf token generator in the deck, it'll buff those wolves. The wirewood something symbiote, the thing that creates insects, it'll affect that. So she does buff the non-elf stuff too. She's a Lord, which makes it really attractive to me to want to put in it. And I love the Rebecca Guay art. The reason why I took it out is because I did try to buff the deck up a little bit, and a 5 mana creature is just kind of high on the curve. There are several elves that are 5, 6, 7, 8 mana that I wouldn't even consider putting in the deck just because it's so high on the curve that it works against what the deck is trying to do. Kanda's Banner is a little bit more reasonable in that it's 2 to cast, 2 to equip. It can only be equipped to a legendary creature, but that's not a big deal. You either put it on Marwyn if she's out. If not, you could put it on, if for some reason Marwyn's been killed a couple times and she's not in play, you can put it on, Azuri, Dwynen, Izuri. If you happen to include the Glissa or the Rishkar, or I do have Nissa in mind. There's plenty of legendary elves that are in the deck, or that you could also include in the deck if for some reason Marwyn was inaccessible. Maybe an opponent stole it. But yeah, you get all of your green creatures will have +1/+1, and all of your elves will have +1/+1, which is all of your creatures, except for possibly the insect tokens or whatever. So buff all your team by +2/+2. Primeval Bounty, this one says every time you cast a creature, you get a 3/3 beast. Every time you cast a non-creature, you put 3/1/1 counters on something, probably Marwyn. Every time a land ETBs, you gain 3 life. So this one, again, because it's 6 mana and it slows you down, it takes up an entire turn somewhere around turn 4 or 5, and really tempos you. I guess some of these effects that tempo you are good in that you're not swarming the board with creatures all right away at once. So if an opponent happens to board wipe or is looking to board wipe, you're not quite as vulnerable to it yet, and you don't have as many permanents on board, which is often what people look at when saying how scary you are. You know, when you cast 4 spells, even if they're 1/1 elves, people are going to look at you like you're a huge threat, even if you're not. But if you have 1 enchantment, even a good one like this, or Doubling Season, or Mana Reflection, or whatever, it's not as threatening. But if they do have the removal for it, then that is a pretty big blow. Evolutionary Escalation, 2 mana enchantment. Put 3/1 counters on one of your creatures and a creature an opponent controls during your upkeep. So this one does take you have to wait at least 1 turn for it to do anything, because the turn it comes into play, it doesn't do anything. This one is good if you get it out very early. The later you get it, especially on your big turns, it won't do you any good. Also, if your opponents happen to not have any creatures in play, it doesn't do anything. If you cast this before you have any creatures in play, it doesn't do anything, because you have to target one of yours and one of your opponents. So if you don't have 2 targets, it doesn't do anything. Ronus's Monument, this one will make all your green creature spells cost 1 less, which is pretty good, but you know, a lot of you do have a decent number of 1-drops, but most of them are more than 1, so the discount's very good. And then whenever you cast a creature, target creature gets +2/+2 and trample. That'd be great for buffing up Marwyn. Great way to really get her bigger. But again, Evolutionary Escalation, Ronus's Monument, Primeval Bounty, these are more cards that really just care about getting Marwyn bigger, and are looking to buff her up, which isn't necessarily fitting into the idea or the spirit of the deck of making it a just elves on elves, doing elf thing, very elfy. Hydra's Growth, Predatory Hunger, these are a couple of auras. The Hydra's Growth will put a 1/1 counter on a creature, whatever it equips, obviously. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you double the number of 1/1 counters on it. Very powerful for Marwyn. Predatory Hunger says whenever an opponent successfully casts a creature spell, put a 1/1 counter on whatever it's enchanted to. So again, these are 2 things that just really want to focus on Marwyn. And as non-creature spells, I don't have a lot of room for non-creature spells, and focusing on Marwyn as opposed to just making it really elf tribal goes against what I'm trying to do with my deck. But they are good inclusions, especially that Hydra's Growth. Predatory Hunger is good in that it's only 1 mana, so it's a lot easier to get it out early, quick, whatever. Retreat to Kazandu. This one has landfall. Whenever a land ETBs, you either gain 2 life or put a 1/1 counter on target creature. You would almost always target Marwyn, obviously. So this one's bad in this deck for 2 reasons. One, because you're focusing too much on Marwyn and not being an elf deck. And 2, as I've said with a few other things, this isn't a land deck. There's not a ton of lands in it. Unless you've got your massive land draw online, there's a good chance that you're going to miss land drops because you're not drawing them. There's not a whole lot of creatures in the deck that put extra lands into play. There's a few, and I've given you options for a few more, but you're not going to get an exceptional value off of this. Next is Alpha Status, which says it's an aura. It gives the enchanted creature +2/+2 for each other creature in play that shares a creature type with it. Great card to put on Marwyn. Again, focuses too much on her by herself. Great for buffing her up and giving you tons of mana, and can really help you on the mana side of having that big explosive turn, as does Stoneforge Masterwork, which is an equipment that gives equipped creature +1/+1 for each other creature you control that shares a creature type with it. But again, they focus too much on just Marwyn by herself, and that's not really. Also, they're non-creature spells, and I need the non-creature slots to be card draw, so there's just not room for it, and it just kind of goes against the style that I've gone with. But they're worth pointing out. Obviously, this whole video is about giving you options to build the deck in a way that you like, and those cards make sense with Marwyn, and if that's how you want to do it, it's a pretty powerful way of building her. So now let's look at the budget scale with all of these, and you can see there are a lot of high-end cards. The Doubling Season, Concordant Crossroads, Primal Vigor, Branching Evolution, Door of Destinies. You could spend a lot of money on these cards, but even if you went the route where you're trying to focus on Marwyn and put a ton of counters on her, I don't think Doubling Season and Primal Vigor are great choices, or Branching Evolution, a little less, a little bit better, but I don't think that they're great choices because they tempo you. They cost you an entire turn where that's like all you do. If you hit them with Genesis Wave, then sure, you can hit these and then a ton of creatures and then put twice that many counters on Marwyn, but you've probably cast her to cast the Genesis Wave. It's, in a lot of cases, they're not going to perform up to how good these cards are overall in the wide world of Commander. On the cheap end of the scale, you've got things like Alpha Status, which would be very good in this deck. Dragon Throne of Tarkir, I think, is something that you don't want to overlook. Ronus' Monument is great for both the cost reduction and buffing up Marwyn. Tribal Unity, another one that, again, if you're at a point in a game where you have mana but not necessarily card draw, it's a great way to pull off a combat trick. And then in the medium range, Overwhelming Stampede is a good card that can really just win you the game on the spot, usually. So, the final category of cards, which I'm not even going to cover individually. I'm just going to show you them all at once. Here it is. There is a strategy in ultra budget decks, and I think Commander's Quarters made like a $10 Marwyn deck. And it's to cast all these spells that just untap Marwyn. Some of them buff her up, give her like +1/+1 or +2/+2. Some of them are counters, some of them are till end of turn, whatever it might be. And they're very, very cheap. There's like, 10 of them that are under a dime. And that's how you get a hyper budget Marwyn deck that focuses more on her, less elf tribal, less whatever. They often have some sort of infinite. There are a few cards that I haven't even mentioned and won't mention because they are strictly infinite combo pieces. When making this deck tech, I could have, I know this is a way for you to make the deck your own, and you might choose to take her in an infinite route, but I've still at least made it a point not to include those, so that if you want to build the deck in the spirit of non-infinite, this whole video will keep you in line for that. But yeah, these are things that you'd put in a hyper budget Marwyn deck that focuses all on Marwyn. It's all eyes on Marwyn. The other elves don't matter. Even, there aren't even necessarily a whole lot of elves. And the goal in those decks is to find some sort of loop where you generate infinite mana, or can just generate a ton of mana and do some other big game-ending type thing. The thing that I'm most familiar with involves like infinite, and someone that I played with or played against who had a Marwyn deck. In the game we played, he built it budget, and I think he used some of these cards. He got his Marwyn up big enough to where she could generate like 8 or 10 mana, and he had, I believe it's called Pristine Talisman. It's not on this page. I'm not showing it, but it basically says whenever you cast a spell, you can pay a green and untap a permanent. And then he had the thing with buyback, the thing that'll create a saproling, and it has buyback. So he spent like 6 mana on that, paid 1 to untap Marwyn, tap Marwyn, keep casting it, make infinite saprolings, and then win. It's a viable strategy, but it's not an elf deck, so that's not really what I've covered a lot with this video. You will see in future videos I do have plenty of infinite combo decks. I do have decks that do a variety of different things. You saw in some of those win condition cards. Some of my decks are strictly kind of looking to attack and win through combat damage. A lot of them have, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 completely different win conditions that don't even care about combat. So just look forward to some of the other videos that are upcoming in this series, and thank you for joining me.